climate kleptocrats. And we also have a daily Biden dumpster fire, but no dumbest bill in America. This is Mark Fisher with Mark and the Millennials. And the millennial joining me today is, of course, Christopher Hopkins, our producer. Welcome, everyone, to Mark and the Millennials. This podcast is called Climate Kleptocrats. You want to know why? First of all, let's define a kleptocrat. A kleptocrat is a ruler, a leader, who uses political power to steal their country's resources. A climate kleptocrat, however, is a ruler who uses political power to direct a country's resources to their political supporters. And this is increasing more and more in politics. By the way, podcast listeners, it increases and has been happening for many years, both on the left and the right. But the biggest kleptocracy in the United States of America is the climate kleptocrats. The climate kleptocrats are simply out of control. These are the people that tell you that we only have 10 years left. Now, I hear this all the time. We only have 10 years left. Now, if you notice, they don't necessarily say 10 years left to live. They say you have 10 years left. And when you ask the question, 10 years left before what happens? Like, well, the raging seas and the winds and the changing weather and the snow and the heat, and it's just going to be so unbearable. We're not going to be able to live. So what is their suggestion? And that really is where the kleptocracy starts. How do I know this? Well, in the federal government, you know John Kerry, remember him? Well, apparently he's still like the climate czar. And there's a question that was asked, and that is, how much money is he being paid by the feds to be the so-called climate czar? So in the Daily Wire, how much are taxpayers paying climate czar John Kerry? He won't say, but one GOP senator is demanding answers. John Kerry, President Joe Biden's White House climate czar, flies around the globe in a gas-guzzling jet. By the way, climate czar, where is that? Is that a cabinet position? And if you want to know why your federal government is out of control, you're supposed to have cabinet positions. And those cabinet positions are filled by the President of the United States, granted, with the advice and consent of the United States Senate. But I don't know where there was ever a climate czar, but there is. So John Kerry, President Joe Biden's White House climate czar, flies around the globe in a gas-guzzling jet, warning refugees that the worst is yet to come if the world does not stop emitting carbon dioxide into the air. It is unclear how much he is paid or who is even on his staff, which is odd because the United States taxpayer is footing the bill for Kerry's travel and his salary. After the Boston Herald was told by the government to submit a Freedom of Information Act request to find out that information, Alaska Republican Senator Dan Sullivan is demanding answers. On Thursday, Boston radio legend Howie Carr interviewed Sullivan on his daily radio show. Carr informed the senator that Kerry's office told the Herald, where Carr also writes a column, by the way, that they would have to submit a FOIA request and could expect to hear back by 2024 to find out how much money Kerry is actually making from the government. Folks, did you just hear that? We're not allowed to know what John Kerry is being paid by us, the taxpayer. We're not allowed to know. You have to submit a FOIA request, which is a Freedom of Information Act request, and they might get back to you as late as 2024. So then the answer was what? That should be public. My salary is online, Sullivan responded. The Secretary of State's salary is online, and the president's salary is online too. According to the paper, the State Department, which oversees the mysterious climate office, felt that the paper's inquiry did not meet the standards for an expedited response. So Sullivan also told Carr that Kerry's presence on the world stage in light of the war in the Ukraine is doing the country a disservice, especially when comparing the immediate threat of war with potential climate disaster. Quote, it's almost getting embarrassing to try to bring a moral equivalent of his job right now to the carnage and brutality and horrendous suffering happening in the Ukraine, Sullivan said, a former Marine, which Sullivan is. He said, quote, I think people cringe when they hear this, and it just shows how out of touch John Kerry really is. As the Daily Wire recently reported in February, Kerry told the media that the bigger impact from Russian President Vladimir Putin's military invasion of the Ukraine could be the effect that it has on the environment, as well as world leaders focus on climate change. So look, I want to qualify this. It's obvious that when you have a dictator like Vladimir Putin, some say he's authoritarian. It's obvious at this point that he's a dictator because he decided to invade a sovereign nation. It's obvious that the impact of leveling cities and leveling power plants and infrastructure clearly affects the environment, okay? So I will certainly concede that clearly you look at this and you say, this is stupid. This is affecting the environment. But the weird thing about Kerry is John Kerry is really not worried about that. He's not even worried about the people, which is really kind of strange, right? He's not, instead of the millions of people that have been displaced from their homes, and I think in the Ukraine, there are some 30 million people that live there. So imagine the millions of people that have been displaced from their way of life. Kerry's not worried about that. He's worried about climate change. And he's not really even talking about the fact that Vladimir Putin is responsible for this. Oh, no. His theory is you just keep talking about this and we just can't know what he makes. We can't know how much money he makes. That's not allowed. So folks, out there in podcast land, you must know this. The climate kleptocrats are up to no good nationwide. And I want to prove to you why this is the case. So you have, first of all, John Kerry. You're not allowed to know how much he makes. First of all, there really isn't supposed to be a climate change czar. We, the people, didn't elect the climate change czar. I think we should be electing these people if we really want them. And we should have limitations on what they're supposed to be doing. Very clear idea of what their job is and what it's supposed to do. But we don't know this. And in my own state, podcast listeners of Maryland, and this is also happening in California and in New York and in Illinois and in Connecticut and all of the far left states, Oregon, Washington State, the climate kleptocrats are operating at full throttle to literally ban anything and everything you can possibly imagine. And on Mark of the Millennials, we often do dumbest bills in America based on banning because the left, they don't really have solutions. They just ban stuff, right? So their solution is, well, climate change is an existential threat. So therefore, we just must ban stuff. And then meanwhile, you're left in the lurch trying to figure out how to fill the void because the left never invents anything anymore. And by the left, I'm talking about the elected left, but also the unelected left, like John Kerry. So what have they tried to ban so far in Maryland? By the way, this has also happened in Illinois and New York and California. In Maryland, and I know this the best since I'm in Maryland, they've tried to ban the climate kleptocrats, leaf blowers, propane gas, natural gas, kerosene, gasoline, oil, plastic straws, plastic cups, plastic food condiment holders that would hold things like ketchup and mustard and mayonnaise, as well as plastic go-to or to-go food holders. So, for example, you do carry out from DoorDash or you just do carry out yourself and you go to the restaurant, and they're trying to ban and have successfully, by the way, at least in Maryland, ban the idea that you can't have the food inside of a plastic holder. It must be something else. It must be made of something else. They're trying to ban shampoo bottles in hotels, which, by the way, Marriott came out for naturally because Marriott wants to engage in regulatory capture of all of their smaller competitors, which is what that's about. So the climate kleptocrats are not just interested in regulatory capture. The climate kleptocrats are interested in first banning something and then potentially retargeting the resources of your state or the country to their donors. That's why they're kleptocrats. So, for example, if the climate kleptocrats want to ban automobiles that operate on a combustible engine, then their donors are the individuals and the companies that make batteries. The climate kleptocrats want to ban propane, natural gas, kerosene, gasoline, oil, plastic straws. Well, I'm sure the paper straw lobby is probably giving money to the climate kleptocrats. Plastic cups, same thing. The folks that make paper cups. But the fact of the matter is, folks, none of these things, of course, when you look at them, the Democrats really don't have a solution. They're like, oh, well, there really is this other thing. You can use paper straws. Have you ever tried to use a paper straw for any period of time at a restaurant? You're like, okay, thank you so much for the paper straw that you gave me 15 minutes ago. Now that my dinner is here, can you give me another paper straw? Because the paper straw that I have is all mushy and doesn't work anymore. Same thing with the idea of kerosene and gasoline and propane. I mean, you ever tried to cook with just electric? I mean, to be honest with you, we have an electric stove in our house and it's awful. And we can't wait to get rid of it because it doesn't properly heat or evenly heat anything. The kleptocrats in America are all about redirecting government resources to their friends, to their donors, to their business associates. And it's happening at an ever increasing rate. And you must ask the question, well, why is it that the climate czar makes all this money and no one actually knows how much money that is or how much power he actually is or what he's actually doing? Meanwhile, of course, he's on a private jet flying all over the world, which is, or a military jet. And I'm sure he's probably like one of the only people on the military jet. Yes, well, today I'm John Kerry. I want to fly to Africa because I'm going to talk about the climate in Africa because, the fact that I should be able to fly private, but you can't fly private. And oh, by the way, we're going to get rid of the fuel that makes airplane travel possible, but not for me, only for you. So Democrats and kleptocrats never actually invent anything. They only ban things. And I think that the American people would be a lot more receptive to innovation and maybe bills that incentivized innovation and other ideas. But that's not what the kleptocrats want. They want to do full frontal banning. And it's really that bad. It really is that bad. Just ask your local state representative, if you live in a blue state especially, ask them, what are all the things in the past 5 years that Democrats have tried to ban? And what are their solutions in lieu of the banned product if the bill were to pass? And they really don't have solutions. They're just like, no, it's bad. We must ban it. We must ban it, but don't worry. Someone else will figure something out at some point in time. Of course they will, because that's just the way things work. No, it's actually not the way things work. Typically what happens is people become educated about an issue and then eventually they start buying alternatives because the alternatives work better. And hopefully the alternatives that work better also at the same time are cleaner. That would be a really uniquely American solution, which is the way, kind of the way I was raised. Pretty sure that's the way you were raised too. And that is climate kleptocrats, the climate kleptocrat czar. Next up, podcast listeners, should 6-year-olds learn trans indoctrination? Probably not. Of course they shouldn't. Of course they should not. So Bill Maher defends the Florida bill. I think it's House Bill 1557. And it's kind of shocking that Bill Maher would actually come out against this type of bill. But thankfully, there is a liberal out there somewhere who thinks this is a really bad idea. Hopefully more liberals across the country will, have an awakening and realize how sick this is. House Bill 1557 is a parental rights bill for public education. And we'll go more into this bill briefly. We've talked about it, I think in the past a little bit. But first up, here's Bill Maher setting this up about House Bill 1557 in Florida, pretty interesting series of clips. Here's the first.
Somebody asked this. Is Florida's Don't Say Gay bill designed to trap Democrats into saying they support teaching young children about sexuality? Is the question, but we can broaden that to anything about that. I mean, I was reading about it today. I mean, if people don't know, this is something DeSantis is about to sign. Yeah. And I guess it's a reaction to Republicans who feel that there's too much talk in lower grades. I think they're talking about kindergarten to third grade. So We're talking about very young kids who, as always with this stuff, there's not like there's no kernel of truth in that maybe kids that young shouldn't be thinking about sex at all. I don't think it's...
Talk about a revelation, right? Can you imagine the left just maybe 6 months ago or yesterday ever having this conversation? Namely, maybe kids in, pre-K, K, first, second, and third grades shouldn't really be educated about or talking about sex at all in the classroom. You think? How did we even get here? So here's Bill Maher again. I love how he says he watched CNN. Cracks me up. I mean, he's just an endless lefter. But anyway, here's the next clip.
What part of the bill? It says the measure this is from CNN, would require districts to adopt procedures for notifying a student's parent if there is a change in the student's services or monitoring related to the student's mental, emotional, physical health or well-being. Okay, then it says something LGBTQ advocates argue could lead to some students being outed to their parents. That phrase struck me as odd. Like, outed to parents? Like, shouldn't parents know everything anyway? The concept of...
Shouldn't parents know everything anyway? And podcast listeners, keep in mind what we're talking about here. House Bill 1557 in Florida does nothing more than say pre-K, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and third grade. You're outing your child. The teacher doesn't want to have a conversation with the parent about what the hell would a teacher have a conversation about a parent about sex and their children anyway? I mean, the only exception to this that I can possibly imagine is if the kid were bringing inappropriate, things to the classroom, which means that they're probably seeing this or hearing this back home. Instead, the kid would be bringing inappropriate things from the classroom itself back home to the parents. And so the idea that the left would be upset that any parent would want to know what is happening in the classroom, number one, and number two, that under no circumstance should any sexual course be taught or discussed in a classroom of kindergarten, first and second, third grade. It's just kind of common sense. And even Bill Maher is like, I watch CNN and, even CNN is talking about this bill. And of course, CNN's talking about this bill because they hate Governor DeSantis, who signed the bill into law. And CNN, of course, torched Governor DeSantis because even CNN thinks it's okay for kids to be taught these things in kindergarten, first and second and third grade, and also pre-K. And just to set this up even further, because we have another clip on this, left-leaning comedian, this is in the Daily Wire, Bill Maher defended the Florida bill that critics have unfairly labeled Don't Say Gay bill, arguing that the overtime portion of Friday night's episode of Real Time with Bill Maher is when he talked about it. Maher discussed the issue with New York Times columnist Frank Bruni and Newsweek Batya Angar-Sargon columnist, and Maher pointed to the fact that the bill does not actually say banning gay or using the word gay at all, and clearly addresses only classroom instruction for children. Now, this is in spite of the fact that everything that you've heard, I'm sure, certainly in the mainstream media, was about the fact that the Florida Republicans were trying to ban certain words from speech. And it's like, no, not at all. The Florida people, the representatives in Florida and the governor just didn't want the teachers having this kind of discussion with children. So kind of like obvious, right? Common sense, like where we used to be maybe just 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And the fact that here we are in 2022 and we actually have to have this conversation at all. We have to actually pass legislation. Since when do we need to even pass legislation to stop this from happening? What it means that it's happening. And this kind of legislation should be passed in every state legislature. So here is Batya Unger Sargon. She's a columnist at Newsweek, obviously a pretty daggone liberal, needless to say, hack of a magazine. And she's discussing this with Mar in his little panel about House Bill 1557. We have that clip. And here it is.
One that I read right before the show was that the vast majority of the bill is about parents' right to know if their child is identifying, changing the way that they're, presenting, if the teacher's calling them by a different name, this kind of thing.
I think in California, the school has more of those rights than the parent.
Well, that's not right.
That's right. Okay, great.
Oh, yeah.
Well, that's not how everybody feels out here. It's like we need to protect the student from the parents with the school. The school and...
Yeah, that's a political winner. Yeah.
Right. Well, oh, you should live out here for a while. You'll see some crazy shit. Okay.
And Mars like, yeah, if you lived out in California, you'd see some crazy stuff happening out here, and anything is possible. Well, anything is possible, obviously, in all of these blue states. This is happening in Maryland. It's happening in New York State. It's happening in Jersey. It's happening in California. It's happening in Illinois, just to name a few. By it, I'm talking about inappropriate school instruction, pre-K through third grade, about trans indoctrination, and by the way, any kind of sexual conversation. A teacher talking to your children like little tiny kids and discussing these things with your kids and thinking that's appropriate. In normal times, we would actually have that teacher charged and potentially fired. But this is how far the left has gone. It has infiltrated every aspect of public education. And so Florida Governor DeSantis, we played this clip previously at the last podcast, I believe. DeSantis was questioned about House Bill 1557. So you just heard Bill Maher having this reasonable discussion about why this bill makes sense and does nothing like what the media said it was trying to do. Here is the media trying to call the bill the, quote, "Don't Say Gay" Florida bill. And they say this to, of all people, Governor DeSantis, who just torches them. We have that clip. And here it is.
Parental rights and education, what critics call the "Don't Say Gay" bill, is on the Senate floor.
Does it say that in the bill?
Know that you support.
Does it say that in the bill?
I'm
asking you to tell me what's in the bill, because you are pushing false narratives. It doesn't matter what critics say.
Hold on. It says it bans classroom instruction on sexual identity and gender orientation.
For who?
For
grades pre-K through 3. So 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, and the idea that you wouldn't be honest about that and tell people what it actually says, it's why people don't trust people like you, because you peddle false narratives. And so we disabuse you of those narratives. And we're going to make sure that parents are able to send their kid to kindergarten without having some of this stuff injected into their school curriculum.
Amen to that. Amen to that. And finally, you have Bill Maher, of course, talking about DeSantis in a way, and the Republicans in Florida about House Bill 1557, and saying, you know what, this is kind of a reasonable bill. I mean, why would we be talking about kids anyway about the subject matter? I mean, really? I mean, when did this happen? And so if you think that is enough, folks, and that we need to pass this bill across the nation, state by state, I think it's a brilliant idea, by the way. Well, here is another example of what is really happening across America with respect to your children and how the left is trying to groom your children into their very sick trans ideology, among other things, and to sexualize and groom your children just in general, which, by the way, is illegal. So in the Gateway Pundit, disturbing, leftist activists organizes, quote, sex ed summer camps for 8 to 10-year-old children in Indiana. You'll love this. Not, of course. A leftist activist in Indianapolis, Indiana, is hosting a sex ed summer camp that will teach 8 to 10-year-old children about woke sex ideology, transgender theory, and how to use condoms, among other disturbing things. These are 8 to 10-year-olds. The camp, right? It's a summer camp, which is being organized by self-proclaimed children's sexuality educator Ashley Robertson, is being advertised for children in grades 3 to 5 who can be as young as 7 years old. In other words, way too young for some adult who's not their parent to discuss this matter with them. Major hat tip to Choice Media Executive Director Tony Kinnett, who exposed Robertson's event in a long tweet thread. So this story was broken. It's a real story, ladies and gentlemen. This is a real camp. It is a real camp for 8 to 10-year-old children. And it's run by radical, crazy leftists who are trying to groom your children to be sexually active in elementary school. As is always the case with radical leftists, they are playing a game of hide the ball when it comes to their insane agenda. In this case, Robertson, who put this camp together, weaves benign-sounding topics into the itinerary to mask the true perverted nature of sexualizing third graders. However, things get even more disturbing when realizing how radical Robertson and her views truly are. According to her bio on Multi-Amory, a leftist progressive podcast, never heard that one before, Multi-Amory, a leftist progressive podcast. Robertson is a self-proclaimed expert on age-appropriate education about sex and consent for children, who identifies as a feminine, bi-curious, ethically polyamorous. What is polyamorous? Sexual submissive. So I gotta read that again. I'm sorry, podcast listeners. According to her bio on Multi-Amory, which is a leftist progressive podcast, Robertson is a self-proclaimed expert on age-appropriate education about sex and consent for children, who identifies as a feminine, bi-curious, ethically polyamorous, sexual submissive. And ladies and gentlemen, do you really want that person teaching your kid at a sex ed camp when your kid is in 3rd grade? You know, I'm not sure, or 4th grade, or 5th grade, or 6th grade. Not only that, this so-called children's specialist also over a decade of experience in the BDSM scene and isn't shy of perverse topics to boot. So we got our millennial here who's laughing like crazy behind the camera. So Chris, what does BDSM stand for? The acronym? I don't know. You must know. Anyway, in a podcast appearance on Multi-Amory, Robertson discussed topics like introducing pornography to kids, polyamorous relationships, which I guess means non-monogamy, teaching kids to talk to people outside their family, in other words, strangers, and how to discuss kink. She even torched on how to discuss these topics with children who have special needs. Disgusting, podcast listeners. You found it? What is it? BDSM?
This is bondage.
Bondage. Okay, so there you go, podcast listeners. This genius wants your kid to go to a camp, and they're hiding what the camp is about for your elementary school age children to teach you about bondage, among other things. Can you believe this? I mean, this stuff is real. What do you have?
Bondage, domination, sadism, and masochism.
Bondage, domination, sadism, and masochism. Yeah, for your elementary school kid. And so you have, here's what I often get, podcast listeners. Okay, I often hear this from people out there in podcast land and elsewhere. When we post about this on the Mark and the Millennials media and so forth, media outlets, people say, oh, it's not true that any of this is happening in elementary school. Children are not being taught these things in elementary school. It's just wrong. You're lying. You're not telling the truth. Folks, not only is it happening, but now we see that there are sex ed camps. And there are some teachers, emphasis on some, who are all in on this ideology, this sick, illegal ideology, by the way, who are leading children and parents to these sex ed camps. And we know this is happening. So for those of you out there who say, oh, it's just not possible. You are just trying to stretch the truth to try to get listeners or whatever. Folks, it is so happening right now in American public education. And sometimes it's happening with the full support of the administration, meaning the principals and vice principals and the superintendent of the public school system. And other times, to be fair, it's just a rogue teacher that's doing it. We don't know in any particular situation who's encouraging this, and other than the fact that we have to start investigating it and then pass bills like House Bill 1557, like they did in Florida. And that is Bill Maher. Bill Maher agrees with DeSantis. Hard to believe. Next up, podcast listeners, Kamala Harris says that the refugees causing the crisis in Poland, what does she say? She laughs at it. Folks, this is your Vice President of the United States. If you did not hear this already, you have to hear this press conference. So Kamala Harris was in a press conference with the president of Poland. Now, Poland, as you know, podcast listeners, basically adjoins, right, abuts up to the Ukraine. The Ukraine is being invaded by Russia. Russia is leveling its cities, killing its citizens, crushing its infrastructure to make it a place that is unlivable. And so, naturally, the Ukrainian people are migrating outside of country to places where they can be safe and find food and shelter and warmth, understandably. So this question was asked to Kamala Harris because naturally, when you have a war in a neighboring country, there is a humanitarian crisis that flows over into your country, in this case, Poland and other neighboring countries. Well, Poland is a part of NATO, so Kamala Harris went there to discuss all the different kinds of security issues. She gets a question from the press, and she has the typical Kamala Harris answer, which is just bizarre, podcast listeners. We have that clip, and here it is.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Vice President. I wanted to ask you about some reporting that my colleague here in Poland noticed. He recently spoke with the mayor of the largest border town, who told him that the refugee system is essentially not set up for this, that it will collapse. It's an improvised system that can work for maybe 2 weeks, but not indefinitely. And I'm wondering what the United States is going to do more specifically to set up a permanent infrastructure. And relatedly, is the United States willing to make a specific allocation for Ukrainian refugees? And for President Duda, I wanted to know if you think, and if you asked the United States to specifically accept more refugees.
Okay. A friend in need is a friend indeed.
Okay, I can first. Okay, so this time.
That was a very serious question from the press. Okay, a very serious question to the Vice President of the United States about what will the United States do or be willing to do as it relates to the millions of Ukrainian refugees. What will we do to help them? What can we do to help them? What kind of commitments can we make to help these individuals engaged in this humanitarian crisis, the largest humanitarian crisis since World War II? And Kamala Harris's response is, I mean, just laughing. It's weird. And then she looks over to President Duda of Poland, like saying, please help me. You know, she has this look of, please, President Duda, please help me with the answer, because I don't know how to answer questions like this, because I'm a vacuous, stupid, left-wing idiot who never really learned anything in college because I didn't have to. Because in California, as long as you go with the woke ideology and you're indoctrinated, you don't know how to answer any questions because there's no critical skills that are required of thinkers in California, which is, you know, why she was chosen as Vice President of the United States, because she's an idiot. I mean, can you imagine a very serious question about people who are dying, that are starving, that want to stay warm, they have their children, they're leaving the country, they're coming across the border into Poland, and she's like, a friend in need is a friend indeed. What the hell does that mean? You know, and I rarely curse on Mark and the Millennials, hardly, but this calls for it. It's so bizarre. It's so embarrassing. It's so incredibly embarrassing. And so hopefully the American people see this and they realize this individual will be the reason, along with Joe Biden, why the Republican Party not just takes over Congress in probably the largest wave in American history, but will also take over the presidency in 2 years from now, in 2024. And that is Kamala Harris laughs at refugees. Next up, podcast listeners, we have the daily Biden dumpster fire, and it is incredible. Biden says he's cutting the deficit. Podcast listeners, Joe Biden is in front of the Democrat National Committee for a planned speech. This was just 2 days ago. He's in front of the Democrat National Committee about setting policy for not the country, but for the party, the DNC, and naturally talking to them about, hey, don't worry, everything's going to be fine in November. You know, we're going to win. We're going to pick up seats because we're doing all of the right things, including cutting the deficit. Talk about a dumpster fire. I mean, he really said this, podcast listeners. He really said this. We have this clip. Here it is.
Secondly, I want to point out for those folks who attack us for being fiscally irresponsible, let them know this. Last year, I cut the budget $360 billion while we did these other things. $360 billion. And no, I'm the only president who's on track to cut the deficit by more than $1 trillion in 1 year. $1 trillion.
Does anyone out there really believe this? Folks, if you have spending proposals at the beginning of your term, which was 1 year ago for Joe Biden, 1 year and a couple of months is when he started. So 14 months ago, Joe Biden started as president of the United States. When you have very high spending goals for Build Back Better and all of your other plans, and your spending goals are in the trillions and trillions of dollars, and then you have to negotiate with the Republicans who want to eliminate that spending or at a minimum cut that spending in a large way. And you come back and you say, well, instead of spending $5 trillion last year, I only spent, $4 trillion last year. And so therefore I'm cutting the deficit. I mean, this is literally what he's saying. This is the justification behind what he's saying. We are in a new reality in America where you have a Democrat Party that is willing to go so far as to say, we are cutting the deficit. And in 4 years, we will have cut the deficit by $1 trillion. Look, podcast listeners, it's no secret that Republicans and Democrats have been spending like drunk sailors for a couple of generations. This is a big problem in America. And the reason we have inflation in America, is because of the government spending too much money at the same time that the Fed has made credit so cheap and so easy for so long. So those combinations of massive amounts of dollars entering the economy from government has resulted in inflation. And so Biden, of course, knowing this, is like, oh, no, I actually cut the deficit. That's really something that we can run on in November during the congressional elections, as well as in 4 years. I have to play this one more time because you're going to laugh. Laugh out loud when you hear this. Any reasonable person would know that their government is out of control. Just look at the gas pumps, look at the food prices, look at the prices for everything, look at the fact that there aren't enough of things because of the fact that naturally there's too much money in the economy. We have that clip again. Here it is.
Secondly, I want to point out for those folks who attack us for being fiscally irresponsible, let them know this. Last year, I cut the budget $360 billion while we did these other things. $360 billion. And no, I'm the only president who's on track to cut the deficit by more than $1 trillion in 1 year. $1 trillion.
Last year. You ever said that? Last year, I cut the budget by last year. I mean, he's so creepy. Anyone would look at this guy and realize he's not just a fraction of what he used to be, but the fact that he's willing to go this far to lie. And if that's not enough with the daily Biden dumpster fire, Biden warns Democrats It will be a sad 2 years if Republicans take control of Congress. So in the Hill magazine, President Joe Biden issued a warning to his party at the DNC, speech that you just heard. He warned to them that there's a possibility that Republicans are going to take control of Congress in the upcoming midterm elections this November. You won't believe what he said, okay? Here we have the clip, and here it is.
I believe we have a record to be incredibly proud of. An agenda the public strongly supports if you look at the polling data. A message that resonates. Build a better America. Now we've got to do the work. And I've seen what you can do. I saw it in 2020. Nothing was going to stop you then. We can't let anything stop us now. We need to bring some real determination, the same work ethic, the same enthusiasm. And if we do that, we're going to keep the House and keep the Senate and add seats. And by the way, if we don't do that, it's going to be a sad, sad 2 years.
It's going to be a sad 2 years if Republicans take over. I'm not sure if you heard in the background, 2 podcast listeners, someone in the DNC audience there yelled out, 4 more years. It's like, 4 more years? I mean, we wouldn't have an economy. We wouldn't have a government. We wouldn't have a society in 4 more years if these idiots were in control. It's one of the reasons why we're calling this entire podcast Climate Kleptocrats, because their ideology is so messed up. It's so anti-working men and women that they're willing to ruin your lifestyle. They're willing to ruin your standard of living for their ideology because they're that mentally ill. I really believe it. I believe that the Democrat Party as a whole, okay, individuals may be different, and they always are, okay, but as a whole, the Democrat Party, their ideology is one that is engaging in full-blown mental illness because they think it's okay. For the first time in American history, we have a party that thinks it is okay to make your standard of living lower, not just a little bit, by a massive amount because of their ideological kleptocracy about climate change, among other things. But everything is geared around that climate change stuff because there's nothing they can't take away from you with climate change, ideology. And you know that as well as I do. We see it happening day in and day out. And that is the Daily Biden Dumpster Fire. And that's it from Mark and the Millennials. Thank you for joining Mark and the Millennials. This is Mark Fisher. Thank you to our producer, Christopher Hopkins. Check us out on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Getter, Rumble, and our website. See you next time.